Hi, how you doing? And welcome back to another video on the channel. So it's game week 4 time. The international break is coming to an end, and we're going to talk about my team and how it's looking regarding team selection and transfers for this game week because I do have two free transfers in the bank. I've tried to maintain flexibility for moments like this. I'm not going to talk about a review from game week 3 because I did that in a previous video. Go check it out if you haven't seen it already and you want to keep up to date with things like the mini league. That's all in that video. This is about moving forward for game week 4. So, in terms of the fixtures, we are looking pretty good in terms of captaincy. I think Salah is the clear and obvious captain. I don't think you need to overcomplicate it. Sometimes the most obvious answer is the correct answer. One thing I would just be aware of is players who are maybe coming from, South America, say, or from further countries on international duty, whether you think they're going to be back in time to start for their clubs. Doesn't really matter too much if it's just part of your squad, but I think it does matter if you're planning on captaining them. So, like I say, I'll be captaining Salah unless there's some injury news. And I think if you own him, you probably just need to do the same because whilst Burnley are better at home than away, they're not that much better. And I can absolutely see Salah coming back off international duty and getting a couple of goals here. I think if you've got Haaland as well, totally a fine captain option. But for me, the predicted points does look correct at the moment. I think Salah probably will be the top scoring player this game week. So into my team, and I've got 4.5 million in the bank from when I sold Cole Palmer. And the plan was to transfer out either one or two of my strikers this game week, Welbeck and Jimenez, and upgrade them. But now I've got a couple of midfield injuries, and Strand Larsen, my other striker, is injured. I've got five potential players I could move on, and that's before we even start discussing the defence or the goalkeepers. However, in goal, I'm probably not going to move Jordan Pickford. I'm never a fan of making goalkeeper transfers anyway, and I think he's doing really well. So I don't see a need at all to move him on. Aston Villa at home is a totally fine fixture. They've not scored yet this season. Do I expect them to score in this game? Yeah, probably do, but teams score all the time. It's really hard to keep clean sheets. And I quite like the mixture of Jordan Pickford's fixtures leading up to game week 9. It's not the easiest, but there are some potential for high returns, and you think if he does manage to keep a clean sheet against Liverpool or Man City, then he'll probably be getting some bonus and some save points as well. And that's what really helps with your goalkeepers, getting you those big point scores. Into defence, and if I was going to take out a defender, it would be Wan-Bissaka. He's dropped in price and his position no longer looks secure for West Ham. Now, it's a really small sample size because he's only just dropped out of the team in game week 3. But now that I've also got injuries in my squad, I kind of need all my bench players to be starting for their teams. Now, it's not the end of the world because every week you can look at your team score and there's probably about 5 or 6 players in your 11 who score 1 or 2 points. So if he does come off the bench for West Ham and gets 1 point, you know, that could happen anyway. I would like the opportunity for potentially getting more than that. When we take a look at who I could transfer him to, this is what we're seeing in terms of yellow cards versus defensive contributions per start this season among all defenders. So shout out to Nicky. He's a subscriber to the channel. He put this idea in my last video. And it is interesting to look at which defenders are doing well in terms of not only getting defensive contributions, but who aren't getting booked because you might get defensive contributions, you might get the 10 and get those 2 points. But if you're picking up a card as well, then they're kind of nullified, it balances it out. So here we can see the line which signifies 10 defensive contributions per start. So anyone who's above this line is getting more than 10 and getting those 2 points. And we can see that right at the top here, we've got some good options. Now, Virgil van Dijk is a fantastic option, the highest defensive contribution defender this season so far, even though it's a small sample size, but he's also not been booked. I personally really like Senesi from Bournemouth. I think that's a great pickup. I think he's about 4.5, 4.6 million. So if I was going to sell Wan-Bissaka, it probably would be him. I think if I treated myself, probably would go for Lacroix from Crystal Palace because I just think he is doing so well for defensive contributions, and he probably will continue to do so more often than not. I think he's more secure in that area than a Senesi long term. But he is a bit more expensive, and it would rely on double up in the Crystal Palace defence, which with European football coming up, I don't really think that I need to commit to. So I'm very unlikely to make a defender change, but if I did, it would be from Wan-Bissaka to Senesi. And feel free to pause the video at any point because I know these charts are sometimes difficult to look at on the go, just so you can see, where your players might rank, or if you're thinking of making any transfers, how they're looking so far. As the season goes on, this will spread out a lot more. But right now, because we've only had 3 game weeks, it's quite closed in. So into midfield we go, and I was going to take out Ismail Assar if I did decide to make a midfielder transfer. Brought him in for the last game, and he did get me 7 points, which was great. But he also went off with, I think, a hamstring injury, and they're really difficult to recover from, especially for an explosive player like Sa. Now, if I was going to make some transfers, I'd try and stick to around a similar price. But Marmoush has also been injured on international duty as well. And he seems to have like a bruised ligament in his knee. And I'm not too familiar with the recovery time for that. So I am inclined to keep Marmouche. I'm also still inclined to keep Sa because I think if it's not a super long recovery stint, he could then still play a factor in my team. But as we can see, the fixtures, Liverpool and Arsenal from game week 6 to 9, it's not the easiest. You kind of get him in for the game week 4 and 5 fixtures. So if he is injured, I might as well move him on. So let's take a look at the chart. And here we can see the total points versus defensive contributions for midfielders so far this season. Now, if I was going to sell Sarr or Mamouche, I probably would swap to either Grealish, Paqueta, or Bruno Fernandes. Statistically speaking, I already own Semenyo. I'm not too interested in Gakpo because I've still got Salah. And I think for me, any of these are quite good. If I was not brave, but if I was a bit less sort of structured with my team, I'd probably just go for Grealish. But I think statistically speaking, he's not going to get 2 assists every game. And I think he is the sort of player who you get into your squad and then he just blanks for 3 games. Some of these assists that he's been getting have been great, but some, like the one he had for Ghana a couple of game weeks ago, he just literally passed it about 25 yards out and Ghana just smashed it into the goal. And you think, well, how often is he going to get an assist for that? So I think those stats are a little bit inflated. Paqueta, I'm not too fussed about West Ham right now. It's just too much of a risk for me. And Bruno Fernandes is obviously good. He's actually leading the way for players in this price range for defensive contributions. So this is players rated 5.7 million and above in midfield. So I think that really, if I was going to move, it could be for Bruno Fernandes. I quite like the look of Madueke down here at the bottom left. And you might look at this chart and say, why are you thinking of Madueke? He's not really high scoring in terms of points. He doesn't offer defensive contributions. Well, that's when you sort of flip it and you think, well, you know, they've only played 3 games. Those fixtures might have been tough. Madueke didn't start in game week 1. Saka started, and now Saka is injured for the foreseeable future. Madueke is playing well for England. He's very direct and involved. And, instead of going for someone like Gyökeres, I could go for Madueke. And he's the sort of person who I'm not seeing anyone talk about him. Everyone's talking about Gyökeres, and it kind of takes the attention away from someone like Madueke, who's, like we say, explosive and direct. And he is only 7 million, which is really good price for an Arsenal basically forward who's going to be starting every week. So I'd only need 0.5 million to upgrade Sa to Madueke. I'd probably keep hold of Marmouche. That's my midfield transfers. Now, another area that I am looking at is the strikers, and it's something we've been looking for or at for a while, right? All 3 strikers have dropped in price. It was a situation where I was trying to recreate, someone like Haaland's points with cheaper forwards, and I think it could have gone a lot better. I don't think it was a bad decision because, Welbeck has missed an open goal and penalty in his 3 games so far. And you think, well, if one of those had gone in, I'd be getting some attacking returns. Strand Larson, I think, missed game week 3 because he was injured. So he's only had 2 weeks. And Jimenez started 1 game and then was benched the other 2. So I think I'm definitely going to keep Strand Larson, even though he's got a bit of an injury, because I think he could play this game week. The player who I'm more likely to move on out of Welbeck and Jimenez is Jimenez, because he has been on the bench. Welbeck has been starting, and it looks like Rutter is still out injured. So when we're looking at potential striking options, I'm looking at expected goal involvements versus teams that have selected them. So what percentage of FPL managers have selected these strikers in their team? Because whilst I'm looking at Madwake, who's very low owned, up front, I am looking at João Pedro just from a safety score sort of area because if I'm looking at getting a striker in, even though personally I'm not a huge fan of João Pedro in FPL, he is the most owned player, I believe, out of all players in Fantasy League. So who is going to do my rank the most damage in FPL if they have a big score? Well, it's João Pedro. So if he's only 1.3 million more than a striker I've already got, I just think it's too obvious to ignore. So Jimenez to João Pedro is something that I'm looking doing. I could also move to Jokeres, and I could do both Jimenez and Welbeck to João Pedro and Jokeres. I can afford it. So I think that is something that I'm looking at doing, but I'm more likely if I go for Madueke to ignore Jokeres and then get in João Pedro and use those as my two free transfers this game week. And even though, you might be thinking, well, why would you take a striker who's getting minutes out ahead of a midfielder who's injured? And it's really looking at the medium to long term. If I want these players in, I kind of, when Sa or Marmoush, when they come back from injury, I'm going to want them in my team. I don't necessarily want Jimenez and Welbeck in as longer term. I think they're less good options. And really, if Jimenez is just getting 1 point off the bench and Sa or Mamouche are getting 0 points, I'm not actually losing that much by taking out Jimenez before I take out both injured midfielders, if that makes sense. So hopefully that's clear enough in terms of my thoughts. And overall, at the moment, the strengths of my team is they are creating a lot of chances. I do like my team, and I am glad I didn't use a free transfer earlier on in the season in order to count for this now. Because if I had no free transfers or one free transfer, I really would be a little bit stuck because injuries do happen, especially in the international break. And it does offer some flexibility moving forward. You probably won't make these transfers till like Friday or Saturday morning because I just want to see what any team news is that comes out. And I'd probably recommend you doing the same. The weaknesses for my team is we've talked about the strikers and also cheap defenders. These defenders like Estev, Wan-Bissaka, who I don't believe are a major issue, but it is starting to get to that stage where you look at your team and you're thinking, oh, I've got a few problems here. So I would be really interested to hear your thoughts in terms of my transfers, but also if you've got any injury problems as well. What are you leaning towards in terms of, you know, uh, options? And are you going to hang on to injured players? Where do you draw the line? So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully it's helped you out with your own team thoughts as well. And you're looking forward to Game Week 4. And I will see you in the next one.